Good evening, and welcome to the latest in our series of lectures by prominent journalists who have been invited to Middlebury by the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs, and in the case of tonight's lecture, the President's Office. One of the hallmarks of a Middlebury education is that our students learn to communicate clearly and directly across religious, ethnic, and cultural divides. Through interdisciplinary study, co-curricular activities, study abroad, and interaction with other students from varied backgrounds and from more than 75 countries, Middlebury students learn to engage the world. Few people have a better understanding of the importance of that engagement in today's world than tonight's speaker, Jeffrey Goldberg, the award-winning Washington correspondent for The New Yorker. Moved to Israel while he was a college student. He saw the conflict between the Jews and Arabs as the essence of tragedy, because tragedy is born not in the collision of right and wrong, but of right and right. In 1990, during the first Palestinian uprising, Mr. Goldberg was serving with the Israeli army. He was assigned as a prison guard in the largest prison in Israel. There he met Rafik, a rising leader in the PLO, who was among the 6,000 Arab prisoners. Those prisoners represented the heart of the Intifada, its rock throwers, knifemen, bomb makers, and propagandists. Despite their fears and prejudices, Rafik and Mr. Goldberg began a dialogue that grew into a respectful friendship. His most recent book, Prisoners, charts the course of that relationship. It confronts head-on the issues dividing the Middle East, but it also suggests that there is still hope for that embattled region. Prisoners has been hailed as one of the best books of 2006 by the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Slate Magazine, The Progressive, Washingtonian Magazine, and Playboy. Mr. Goldberg is the recipient of the 2003 National Magazine Award for Reporting for his coverage of Islamic terrorism. He is also the winner of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists Prize for Best International Investigative Journalist, the Overseas Press Club Award for the Best Human Rights Reporting for his coverage of the crimes of Saddam Hussein, and the Abraham Kahan Prize in Journalism. He is also the recipient of the 2005 Anti-Defamation League Daniel Pearl Prize. Mr. Goldberg joined The New Yorker in 2000. Previously, he was a writer for the New York Times Magazine, covering the Middle East and Africa. He has also covered the Mafia for New York Magazine, served as the New York bureau chief of The Forward, and been a columnist for the Jerusalem Post. In 2001, Goldberg was appointed the Sirkin Fellow in Letters of the Jerusalem Foundation, and in 2002, he was selected to be a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Over the past 7 years, his reporting has taken him to Afghanistan and Pakistan, where he lived for a month in a Taliban madrasa, as well as to Upper Egypt, Syria, the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, and the Gaza Strip and West Bank. He has interviewed leaders of Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Ansar al-Islam, and the Taliban. He covered the Second Persian Gulf War for The New Yorker from inside Iraq. Tonight, Mr. Goldberg will draw on that firsthand experience as he discusses Israel, Iran, and the future of terrorism. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Goldberg to Middlebury.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. And you're right about Playboy. I was so excited, I couldn't tell you. It was the first time I ever bought it for the articles. It's actually, it's really true. Actually say that. Thank you very much for having me here tonight. Thank you for inviting me up on Global Warming Day, apparently. Somebody told me it was snowing, so I brought a heavy coat, but I guess I'm a few days too late for that. I'm very glad to be here. I have to express one regret, and when Ron, your president, Ron, we were talking about what we should call this talk, I suggested Israel, Iran, and the future of terrorism, and I immediately regretted it as soon as I suggested it, because each of those topics takes in a universe of problems and challenges. They're interrelated, as we all know. but it's much too much for a single talk. And I should have known better, because a few weeks ago I had been asked by another group to come speak to their organization. And I asked the woman who was organizing this what she wanted me to talk about. And she said, well, if you could talk about the current situation in Iraq, the Bush administration's democracy program, the future of the Iranian nuclear program and how it impacts on Israel. Also, if you could talk about the rise of Sunni fundamentalism and how it conflicts with Shiite fundamentalism, and also anything you might have to add about the situation in Lebanon. And then and I said, so how much time do I have for this talk? And she said 15 minutes. And then she said, and listen, this stuff is really depressing. So could you just make it light and sort of entertaining in a way? And I turned down that speaking engagement, surprisingly. But in the interest of keeping everything light and entertaining about this fun-filled region of the world, I will tell you a joke, and you'll see in a moment why I'm telling you this joke, because it sort of encapsulates how I look at the world sometimes. There's a very, very hot day, not unlike this one, very hot day, and a German guy runs into a bar, and he says to the bartender, I'm so hot and tired and thirsty, I must have beer. So the bartender gives him a beer. A few minutes later, a French guy runs into the bar and says, I'm so tired and thirsty, I must have wine. Gives him a glass of wine. A few minutes later, a Jewish guy runs into the bar and says, I'm so tired and thirsty, I must have diabetes. And that guy's me, obviously. I think I have a realistic and sober understanding of the way the world is today, and that I think is born of a kind of Jewish fatalism. I also have something very different that informs the way I see the world, which is an innate sense of American optimism. And when those two ideas collide, it creates a headache, obviously. But realistically, I do feel like that guy sometimes when you look around and you think that maybe the worst things can happen. Obviously, the Jewish experience shows that sometimes the worst things can happen. 9/11 showed us that pretty bad things can happen. And we're in a situation now where you look across the map of the most chaotic part of the world, and you see very few good signs. You see Iraq spinning into chaos. You see an Iranian regime run by theologians who don't seem deterred by mutual deterrence, by theories of rational deterrence. You see Lebanon falling apart. You see the Palestinian-Israeli conflict entering its 101st year with no end in sight. You see dictatorships, very fragile dictatorships in many countries. You don't see anything good. I am not entirely pessimistic, and I want to talk about this for a little bit, because I do believe in the possibility of reconciliation. And I want to focus, with all those topics, let me focus for a little while on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because it's there that's obviously a linchpin conflict in the Middle East and in the world. And it is the place where I actually see the possibility of some hope, not immediate hope, and it's no sure thing, but actually of not given up on this idea that it's possible to create a two-state solution in that region. I will start by talking about why reconciliation isn't always possible, and this is this conflict that I have in me. It's really true that I subscribe, as most of you do without even knowing it, and I didn't really know it till I thought about it. I subscribe to the American civic religion, which is solutionism, which holds that for every problem in the world there's an answer, there's a solution. All you have to do is find that solution and work at it. It's why America is a great achieving nation, because we don't see most problems or any problems as insurmountable. I'm not foolish enough anymore after spending so much time in the Middle East to believe that to be true. And I'll give you one illustration of that. about I guess it's 5 years ago already, I spent part of the summer in Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon. My family has a little place there that we go in the summer. Not a lot of Jews there, but we're trying to develop that. I was there not for fun, believe me, because, you know, the risk is always either you're going to get your interview or you're going to get kidnapped, or maybe you're going to get the interview and get kidnapped. I was there to do a long series of stories about Hezbollah, and this was at a point when there was a debate about Hezbollah, a greater debate than there is today. The debate went as follows. After the Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon, there were a lot of people in academia, in this country especially, who argued that now that Israel has left Lebanon, Hezbollah has lost its raison d'etre, it's lost its jihadist motivation, and it will transform itself into a political / social service organization, and will join the Lebanese polity in a whole way, and it will cease to be motivated by the things that motivate it. I wasn't sure about that, and I wanted to go see for myself. I had a different understanding of Hezbollah already than some people. I didn't see it as simply a organic product of Lebanese political life. I saw it to some degree, as many people now understand it to be, as an arm of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the external arm of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and all that suggests. So I went to, I was staying in Baalbek, which is in the Bekaa Valley. Some of you have probably been there. It's a beautiful town, and I was having lunch with a member of the Shura Council of Hezbollah, which is the sort of religious body that oversees the organization. And this guy was, sort of a pretty humorless guy. I mean, if you join Hezbollah, you're pretty much suggesting your seriousness of purpose, and you're not watching a lot of HBO, and you're serious. This guy was particularly dour and kind of unhappy-looking fellow, and it was a difficult lunch because I try to walk a line when I'm interviewing these kind of guys who generally have figured out that I'm Jewish, and it's not something I hide, obviously. You walk a fine line between wanting to push them to give true answers to questions, and you also want to prevent your own kidnapping, and so we got into a little bit of a tussle on some subjects. And at one point, though, I asked him what I realized later was a very, very American question, and you'll hear it in the body of the question. I said, "What do you hope to gain out of having a better relationship with the United States of America?" And he started laughing at me, and he said, "What makes you think we want to have a better relationship with the United States of America?" And I said, "Well." I was trying to think on my feet, which I'm not very good at. I said, "Well, we're really nice once you get to know us," which I happen to think is true. It's part of our confusion about the world today is that we know that we're nice. How come nobody else sees it that way? And the second point I tried to recover and make a second, more serious point, which is that I think that there are obvious material and political benefits to having a good relationship with the world superpower and the largest economy in the world. And he said, "You just don't understand. We don't want to be friends with you. We want to beat you." And he was in a war. I mean, he was in a war for primacy. And I, just because I didn't know that we were in a war didn't mean that the war wasn't happening. There's this, the Soviet scholar in the first row might correct me, but I think there's an expression in Marx's days that just because you're not interested in the dialectic doesn't mean the dialectic isn't interested in you. The corollary to that I was learning in a very hard way was that just because you're not interested in the jihad doesn't mean that the worldwide jihad isn't interested in you. And there was a sort of a moment when I realized, wait a second, this is not America where we can solve this. And I left that conversation profoundly depressed because I realized that it was not that we didn't understand each other. That was not the reason we weren't getting along. The reason we weren't getting along is that we did understand each other. And so I approach the subject of reconciliation from that, what I think to be realist, through that realist paradigm. I'm not a person who believes, we were talking about this at dinner, I'm not a person who believes in dialogue simply for the sake of of dialogue. I don't believe that you're sitting around a campfire and eating s'mores and singing Kumbaya. Not that I've ever actually seen anybody do that. Is going to solve the problem between Palestinians and Israelis, or Sunnis and Shiites, God knows. But I actually believe that the achievement of disagreement sometimes is a prelude to actually achieving a kind of agreement. And let me tell you, and I want to do this anecdotally rather than analytically, and we're going to have plenty of time for questions, I think. So I don't want to second guess what you're interested in, and I want to make this fairly brief. There is this war going on that undergirds every war that we have in the Middle East. The civil war, a looming cold civil war right now in Lebanon, a slightly warmer civil war in Gaza, the ever-present war between Israel and the Palestinians, the Iraq war, both the American component of the Iraq war and the Sunni Shiite war, Iran's confrontation with the West. There's a war that underlies all this, which is a war between modernity and medievalism, and that's what I want to sort of focus in on a little bit as a way of explaining why I think it's not too late to actually achieve reconciliation. Because we talk very freely about the clash of civilizations, the clash between civilizations, but the consequential clash is the clash that's going on inside a single civilization. That's the clash that we have to focus our eyes on and focus our attention on. And I'll give you perfect examples from Gaza. And Gaza is the place I know best in the Middle East. I spent a lot of time there, and I know a lot of people. And it's actually sort of a sad week for me, because I realized that it's no longer safe to go to Gaza. Gaza has devolved to the point where it's like Iraq now. There was a kidnapping of a BBC journalist, and I'm someone who's been kidnapped twice in Gaza, but have gotten out fairly easily each time. I had one of those cards, do not go to. And I'll explain why I got out of jail fairly easily. But Gaza has shifted now. Al-Qaeda has worked its way into Gaza, and it's on its way to working its way into the West Bank, and so things aren't good, and that's kind of a melancholic thought. But here's the important point. The last time I was there, I went to see. I do a thing where I just check in with a bunch of people. I've known people for 15, 20 years now, and I like to just sort of make my rounds. Some of the people I consider to be friends. Some of them are people who, in a slightly different circumstance, would kill me. The first guy I went to see was one of these guys who would kill me if he had a chance and the opportunity. He was a leader of the Qassam Brigades of Hamas. That's the armed wing of Hamas in the northernmost Gaza Strip, right near the Erez crossing between Israel and Gaza. He's in charge of two basic things. He's in charge of the rocket teams that fire rockets into Israel, and he's in charge of recruiting suicide bombers in that region to be dispatched and trained and dispatched into Israel. Deeply unpleasant guy, but what are you going to do? And I check in with him because he has a very good sense of where Hamas is at any given moment. He's sort of in the middle, ideologically, theologically, in Hamas, and he keeps his contacts up. And I just as a reporter, trying to figure out the level of anger, the level of the possibility of civil war. And in the course of sitting in his living room and talking, his 15-year-old son walks in, who I met years before as a little kid. And so I took the opportunity to ask him, the Hamas leader, a question that I always ask these guys when I see them with their kids, which is, do you want your son to become a suicide bomber? He, of course, objected to the language. It's not suicide bombing, it's martyr bombing to him. But he looked at me and he gave me what I call, and you'll, I think, understand why, I call it the Jewish doctor answer. And it's an answer that I've heard a dozen times in Gaza and in other places, in Iraq too now. And the answer goes like this. He said, of course I'd be proud of him if he became a martyr bomber, but I'm not going to push him in that direction. I want to just have him make that decision for himself. And the first time I ever heard that, which was from a guy named Abdullah Shami, who is the leader of Palestine Islamic Jihad in Gaza, I thought to myself, wait, I've heard that answer before, but it was a slightly different context that had to do with law school for me, rather than rather than blowing myself up and killing other people. And so I was depressed by this, depressed for any number of reasons. I'm a father, and the thought of that kind of human sacrifice is repulsive. As a person who doesn't like any sort of violence, I thought to myself, here's this 15-year-old kid, bright-eyed. He's an artist. He draws. He has, a beautiful, shining smile, very personable. And I'm looking at him and thinking, in 2 or 3 years, he's going to kill himself and kill a bunch of people on a bus who don't deserve to die. And that's a depressing thought. And it got even more depressing because this kid at a certain point ran to his room and got brought out to show me something he called his martyr photo, which in Gaza these days is the equivalent of your yearbook photo. It's a picture that these kids take of them holding weapons, AK-47 usually, dressed in some sort of martial costume, in a sort of a fierce pose with a look on his face. And it's the picture that he takes. This is going to have an obvious domestic echo, obviously. It's a picture that he takes of himself, or has taken, so that when he dies, it will be released in the media and will be put on posters, his martyr poster, and so his life will be celebrated. And it's very important to have the right pose and the right shot and the right clothing and the right backdrop, and it's a symbol for me of obviously a sickness. It got even worse, because at a certain point the kid is sitting on the couch listening to his father extol the virtues of suicide bombing, and the kid looked at me and said, "And I'm his only son," which said to me the following, which said to me that he's not yet dead. I mean, these guys who are recruited to become suicide bombers are known as living martyrs after they go through their initial training. In other words, they're on Earth, but they're already gone. Their minds are already, they've left the Earth mentally. They've left it spiritually. They're already in heaven. And what struck me about this, and what made me feel quite sad, is that this kid was saying that he understood there was something perverse about this situation that he was in. That he's sitting next to his father, who says that he loves him, and yet his father is telling this stranger, and a Jew no less, that he wants his son to die. And I thought then, as I have during these moments, the most depressing thoughts in the world, which is how can Palestinians build a state on the suicide of their young, and how could fathers take the binding of Isaac, I mean the original story of Middle East sacrifice, and take it to its illogical conclusion. And so this was a reason to be depressed, this conversation. A few days later, I went to see another person, a friend of mine. This is a guy who's a real friend of mine. He's a head of one of the Palestinian secret police services in Gaza. Gaza doesn't have much, but it has a lot of secret policemen. And he is the head of one of the 14 different security branches in Gaza. He is a friend of mine because he was once my prisoner. As Ron told you, and some of you who might know the book know, that I spent this period of time just out of my teenage years as a prison guard in this prison in Israel in the first Palestinian uprising. Let me pause here to explain that a little bit, and then you'll understand the context of what I'm about to tell you about this security chief. When I was a person who came to Israel as a good liberal American Zionist. I wanted to. I was entranced as a kid by the stories of the Six-Day War, of the raid on Entebbe. But by the time I got to Israel to join the army, the raid on Entebbe had already been successfully completed. And they didn't need me for that anymore. What they needed were policemen, essentially, because this was during the period of the first Palestinian uprising, 1987 to 1993, when the army, by necessity, transformed itself from an army into a police force in order to suppress this Palestinian uprising. I wasn't interested in being involved in that suppression for any number of reasons. I did not have in my mind the idea that I wanted to be a cop or a prison guard. Furthermore, because I came from a left-wing Zionist tradition, I freely admitted to myself something which in later years, even people like Ehud Barak admitted to themselves, which is that if I had been a Palestinian that age and that time, I would have been out throwing rocks at me. So I understood why these Palestinians in prison were there. So I had 3 goals in the prison. One was to stay alive, which is a useful goal, because the other 2 can't be completed without it. The second goal was not to lose myself. Because what happens in an occupation, and Israel made a key mistake, kind of a mistake that America is making in Iraq right now, to believe that there is such a thing as an enlightened occupation. Occupations can begin in an enlightened way, but they eventually become brutal no matter what you do to try to stop it. And what I wanted to avoid in my own life was doing something that I'd be embarrassed about later. I didn't do anything that embarrassed me. That embarrasses me now. I also didn't do things that would have made me proud of my behavior then. There were moments when I complained about conditions. There were moments when I complained about things. And there were moments that I didn't and I should have. I did walk around with a copy of the Geneva Conventions in my pocket, which I would cite frequently, which got me known as the annoying American guy who won't shut up. The third goal, which flows in a way from the second goal, the third goal was to get to know Palestinians, because I didn't know any Palestinians, because we didn't have any Palestinians on Long Island. We had Italian guys on Long Island, when I was growing up, and I didn't know any Palestinians, and I thought it was kind of a miraculous opportunity in a kind of a perverse way. I thought, here's the cream of the Palestinian uprising. Here's anybody who's anybody in the uprising. I mean, this is really true. People would try, as perverse as this sounds, as weird as it sounds, people would try to get thrown into jail for credibility. I mean, if a Palestinian leader didn't pass through this particular prison, his leadership was in doubt. And so I had this opportunity, as also a budding journalist, or as a sort of an aspirational journalist, I had this opportunity to meet these guys who I knew really nothing about, and so I did. And so over a course of months, I became, in a manner of speaking, friends with them. There was one in particular, this guy Rafik, you mentioned, who I became very close to for a number of reasons. He had something that I found rare among the Palestinians, which is the capacity for self-criticism, or collective self-criticism. In other words, he wasn't merely spouting propaganda at me when we would talk. He would look at the Palestinian national movement and see the flaws in it, the way I saw the flaws in the Jewish national movement. He was funny, which is a rare commodity in a prison. I don't know how many people here spent long times in prison, on one side of the fence or the other. Not happy places. And he was an avid reader, as I was, and we were, and because this was a Jewish prison, we had a library cart that went through every day for the prisoners, and they would take out books, and he would read, and I would read, and we would read the same thing, and we had like a little book club under the sun there, so I became quite close with him. I also credit him with being sort of the first true instructor in my Middle East education, and I'll tell you why, and then I'll loop back to the present. When there was a particularly horrific killing in the prison one day. We had a lot of violence in the prison. There was some prisoner on Israeli violence. There was Israeli guard on Palestinian prisoner violence. Mostly what there was Palestinian on Palestinian violence. Many of you remember that in the Palestinian uprising, by the end of the Palestinian uprising, more Palestinians had been killed by other Palestinians than had been killed by Israeli soldiers. There was a relentless hunt for collaborators. There were real collaborators, obviously, among the Palestinians who were helping the Israeli security services, but there was also, obviously, great paranoia about this, and so they were dealt with in quite brutal fashion. And one morning, we were at the first count. This is at first light, about 5 a.m. The prisoners come out to be counted, and the head prisoner of this one block comes and tells me that, well, we're not going to have one today because he's dead. And I said, what happened? And we've been through this drill before. He said he died in his sleep. They brought the body out, and he had barbed wire marks across his neck. And I said, well, I'm not Quincy MD or whatever that was, but it looks like he didn't die naturally. And we went on from there, and they were very blithe about the whole thing, and it was shocking to me what had happened. And because of this shock, I went to this Palestinian friend of mine, Rafiq, because I had this thought that plagued me after that. I thought to myself, if they do this to another Palestinian, what would they do to me if they had half a chance? Because here I am, as this liberal, enlightened American Jew in this unenlightened place, trying to make friends with everybody, and I'm thinking to myself, well, maybe I'm just being naive. And so I asked, I went to Rafiq. My naivete knew no depths at that point. I went to Rafiq and I asked him a question. I put to him a scenario. I said, imagine that it's 5 years from now, and you're out of prison, I'm not in the prison. We're both in Jerusalem, and you see me walking down the street. I'm in civilian clothing, I'm not in uniform, but you remember me as an Israeli soldier. And not only that, you remember me as your literal oppressor. And I was the guy who had the key and wouldn't let you out of jail. And I said, would you kill me if you had a chance? And he laughed, and of course at that moment I realized that there was something of a power imbalance between us. And I said essentially to him, this is not an Israeli prison official talking to a PLO leader. This is just us guys, and it's off the record. There's no consequences for your answer. I really needed an answer. And he didn't want to answer, and I pushed him on it. And finally he looked at me and said, look, if I killed you, it wouldn't be personal. And that was the beginning of my Middle East education. That was the beginning of trying to understand that there's something deeper going on that I don't truly get. But I didn't give up on this project of mine to get to know these guys and try to figure them out. And the last day in the prison, I went around as, in kind of I had my little red address book from college, actually. It had all my sort of dorm addresses in it. And I still had the same address book. And I went to these prisoners, including some Hamas guys, and I said, listen, I'm leaving now, and sorry you can't go, but I know you're getting out soon, and when you guys get out, I want to come to the Gaza Strip and look you up, and we could just, hang out. And, they're nothing if not polite. And they're like, oh, you are most welcome, and looking at me. And they gave me their addresses, and, it was sort of a goofy project, obviously. And I didn't believe that I would actually do it, and they didn't believe that I would do it, but as you know, the only constant in the Middle East is sudden and dramatic change. And by the mid-1990s, it was really possible to do this because we were in a completely new period of hope. And so I made it a project in the 90s to go find these guys. And luckily for me as a reporter, not only as a person, these guys all had gotten out of prison when Arafat came back to Gaza, when the Oslo peace process started. And they rose very high in the government, in the Palestinian Authority, and in the police services. And so I had Gaza totally wired, because I had these guys who were all, for reasons that are totally inexplicable to me still, personally very loyal to me, and we became friends. This is why you can understand on the most personal level that I'm not without hope, because I have these relationships that started in a position of extreme inequality and have become more equal, and not only become equal, but they've become full relationships, full friendships in a kind of very strange way. Anyway, the guy I'm going to drive to as I'm leaving Gaza is one of these prisoners who I got to know very well. And he's not a, not a sweetheart. He's no Gandhi. He spent 17 years in jail for killing a guy. But he was committed from the time I knew him in the prison until today to the idea of an equitable two-state solution to the problem. He never gave up on that idea, and I believe him to be sincere. I went to see him not just to talk about politics, but I went to thank him because he actually saved me from another kidnapping a couple of days earlier. I had been driving from Khan Yunis in the south of Gaza to Gaza City with my, I have a regular taxi driver when I'm in Gaza, who was also an ex-prisoner of mine. It's like a full employment program that I'm running out of guilt or submerged guilt or something. And we were just driving along, and this car comes in behind us, and comes right right up to the bumper. And it's there's two kinds of ways to follow people. Those of you who are joining the CIA or are currently in it have gone through this training. There's a way of following people to let them know that they're being followed, and there's a way to follow them so that they don't know that they're being followed. This was very deliberately designed to let me know that I was being followed, and moreover, it was sort of a classic beginning pattern of a kidnapping. Four guys in the car, bearded, which is a very ominous thing in Gaza. Obviously, it signifies something about one's affiliation. AK-47s, we could see them clearly. And so I asked the driver, who wasn't happy about this, obviously, because he was going to lose his tires at least out of this. That's one of the first things he said, will you pay for the tires if they shoot them out? And I said, will you just please drive, We're driving along, and he makes a quick left, and they follow, and he makes a right. And it's clearly going on. So, my first phone call is to this guy, the head of one of the secret police services, who was one of my prisoners. Think about how complex this is. And we speak in Hebrew, by the way, when we talk. So I'm in this car being followed by some gang of Hamas gunmen, speaking in Hebrew to one of my ex-prisoners, who's now one of the secret police chiefs of Gaza, and I'm saying to him, listen, I'm about to be kidnapped. Here's where I am. I was outside the Nusayrat refugee camp, and I'm about to, this is going to go down quickly, so could you start working on this? And part of the job, part of the hard part is figuring out who it is. And so he says, there's a moment of silence on this phone, and he says, listen, don't worry about it. And I was like, what do you mean, don't worry about it? And he says, don't worry about it. And I said, I don't think you're hearing me. Of course, his Hebrew is better than my Hebrew. That's one of the ironies of Zionism, is that there are more Palestinians who speak fluent Hebrew than there are American Jews who speak Hebrew today. His Hebrew is better than mine, so I think I'm not communicating well in Hebrew. But he keeps saying, don't worry, you're perfectly safe. And, it takes me a while. But I finally said to him, I said, are those your guys? And he said, I told you, you're perfectly safe. Just come, you'll have lunch, it'll be fine. And I couldn't help myself. Again, this guy has a scar going down the face like this. He lost part of his hand in an explosion. Tough guy. I couldn't help myself. I said, you are really sweet for doing this. I really appreciate this very much. And for the rest of my time in Gaza, I had 4 or 6 or 8 of his guys on me, even outside my hotel door at night. He had obviously gotten a piece of intelligence. They were looking for me. Somebody was looking for me to kidnap me. And it was very, very sweet. So I was going over to thank him for this. And in the course of this long conversation, because there's no short conversations in Gaza, it's a remarkably polite and hospitable place. In the course of this long conversation, I told him about this friend of his, this guy, the Hamas guy, at the beginning of the beginning of the trip, the one with the 15-year-old son who wanted to detonate himself, or his father wanted to detonate himself. And I told him this, and I told him how depressed I was, and I said, if this is what this conflict is, then there's really no hope for this. And I said to him, I said, what do you do? Has your son, because he's a 12-year-old, I said, has your son ever come to you and said, I want to be a martyr bomber? And he said, of course. So, of course, every father in Gaza has to deal with this question. And I said, what do you do when they come to you like this? And he told me what he did. He sat his son down, and he said, do you know what happens to you when you die? And the son said, yes, you go to heaven, and your family is proud of you, and the authority gives your family money, and you're a great hero, and you've killed the perfidious Jews, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, no, that's not what happens when you die. When you die, you go into a hole in the ground, and they cover you up with dirt, and your mother waters your grave with her tears until the day that she herself dies of a broken heart. And I forbid you from becoming a martyr bomber. And I said, does that work? Because there's so many forces working on this kid. Convincing him that this is the right path, and this is the path that not only for personal glory, but for national redemption. And he said, look, it's a constant message, but I explained to him the context, and this is crucial to understand. It's crucial to understand that this side exists in Palestine in huge numbers as well as what you read about every day in Hamas. He says, look, God doesn't put you on earth so that you can run to him in heaven when you're a kid. There's a purpose for all this. And sure, when you're old, you die and you go to heaven. And yes, we recognize that heaven is perfection and the earth is imperfect. But there's a reason that you're here. God doesn't put you here by mistake. He puts you here to make it as good as you possibly can for you and for others. And then when you're old, you can go to heaven and die peacefully in your bed. He lectured his son about the imperfection of the world and the necessity for compromise. And he talks to him constantly about this. And he says, look, we're not going to be happy with whatever deal we get from the Israelis. It's not going to be happy. They're not going to be totally happy either. But everybody's going to live. And that's the goal. And this is what he stresses to his kid, he says, every day. The goal is to stay alive. And the goal is to get the best deal that you can and live in peace and harmony and security. And then when you die, you can talk to God about the imperfections of the world. And I was struck by this, and I was made very hopeful by this, because it was modern. It was life and not death. It was not the exaltation of death. It was saying, this is the world as it is, and we should work within the framework of this world and not blow ourselves up and kill ourselves. And this is in many ways the conflict that's going on. This is not unique, obviously, to the world of Islam. I spent a lot of time covering the other side of this conflict, the settler movement in Israel, and you deal with there the same sort of people who are, for lack of a better word, in a pre-reasoned state of mind. They are getting the word of God directly from God, and God is telling them to do X, Y, and Z, and there's simply nothing to talk about. It's after a while, if you're talking to a Hamas member, you're talking to a Jewish settler in the West Bank, it's as if you're talking to a 4-year-old. Because there's nothing subtle about the conversation. There's nothing complicated about the conversation. He's right, you're wrong, that's it. And this, of course, is the disease and the tragedy of this conflict, and that in the last 10 or 15 years especially, it's transmogrified from a secular national conflict into a religious conflict. Secular national conflict in this context means that it's basically a real estate problem. A theological conflict you can't solve because you can't go against the word of God. That said, and now that I've done my balancing act, I would say that the problem is more deeply rooted on the Palestinian side right now than the Israeli side. The Israelis have a lot ways to go, and I want to end on that and talk a little bit about how that affects Iran in the future. But the Israelis have begun to move in a direction of understanding that the settlement project, for instance, on the West Bank is not tenable. The settlers are a very powerful lobbying group within Israel, and they have disproportionate power. But the average Israeli wants out, and the average Israeli needs is leadership that will help the average Israeli get out of this situation. Palestinians, of course, also lack for leadership. But the thing I hold on to is that poll after poll after poll on both sides of the divide show us that 60 to 70% of people on both sides still seek a two-state solution to the problem, not the apocalypse of a one-state scenario, but a two-state solution. And I would say this, that it's not just a matter of the Palestinians and their Arab friends and Muslim friends grappling with the idea and coming to terms with the idea of the existence of a Jewish state in the Middle East. There's much that Israel can do as well. There's this trope that you hear in Israel quite frequently, which goes that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Well, I'm here to tell you that the Israelis are pretty good at missing opportunities as well. One of the prime opportunities, of course, came after the death of Yasser Arafat, who was, I believe, an impediment to actually solving this. It's not just me, it's many of the people who were around him believe that he was an impediment. If there had been, at that moment of Arafat's death, a different Israeli prime minister, different than Ariel Sharon, that prime minister could have reached across the divide and said to that Palestinian prime minister, said to Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, the new Palestinian leader, said, let's make a deal. Let's start over and let's make this deal. You remember, of course, that Sharon wanted already to pull out the settlements from the Gaza Strip, but he did it unilaterally because he felt that there was nobody to talk to on the other side. There was no more option for bilateralism. He was wrong about that. And he could have negotiated that pullout with the Palestinians, with the government of Abu Mazen, who is a moderate. And out of that would have come an emboldened and strengthened Abu Mazen, an emboldened moderate faction, and we would not have had the victory of Hamas that we had last year in the elections, and we would not have the Hamas government that we have now. So there are moments in the last 4 or 5 years that you look at in wonder, and not just from Israeli foreign policy perspective, but American foreign policy perspective, of these incredible missed opportunities. And what I don't understand, and I'm trying to, I don't know if you could sense this, but I'm trying as a at least superficially objective reporter not to show my hand too much, because I have to cover these people. But I guess by referring to them as these people, that probably gives me away. What I don't understand is the Bush administration's lack of interest in this conflict, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't believe that a solution is a panacea. And I don't necessarily believe that a solution necessarily exists. But I cannot understand for the life of me why we've gone for 7 years since the Camp David process, and no concerted American effort to push both sides to a realistic position. What that does, besides the fact that it prevents death, which I think is a pretty noble cause in and of itself, the prevention of death, what that does, and this brings us right to Iran, it marginalizes Iran, it marginalizes Hezbollah, it marginalizes Sunni extremists who use the Palestinian-Israeli dispute as a recruiting tool, as a way of angering the masses, and as an excuse for terrorism. If you engage in an Israeli-Palestinian discussion right now, and if you really push those two sides to talk, you would totally marginalize Iran. Iran has nothing to do with this conflict. Iran is 1,000 miles away from the conflict. Iranians are Persian, they're not Arab. Iran is playing a very cynical game in the Middle East right now. It's trying to seek Sunni support, Sunni Arab support, by showing itself to be stalwart, showing itself to be the tip of the spear against Israel. But it has no role to play. It certainly has no constructive role to play. And you could solve so many problems right now with a concerted effort to bring the two parties back to the table. I'm not saying that God knows I'm not saying that you threaten Israel back to the table. A weak Israel that feels that America is not its friend is not going to make any bold concessions. The reason Israel was ready to make more concessions than it ever had made in 2000 was that it had an American president, Bill Clinton, and God, it sounds like I'm giving an endorsement speech now. It had an American president who had figured out the key to the Middle East. He really did. He figured out that it's a non-zero-sum game. He realized that just because you're on the Palestinian side doesn't mean you have to be against Israel, and vice versa. If Bill Clinton were to run for prime minister in Palestine or Israel today, he would win. Both of them. I don't know about Hillary, but Obama would run third probably. But because he figured out something crucial about this, which is that you don't have to take from one to give to the other, that there's still enough room. It's not a geographic problem. It's not a matter of having no space between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. It's all in here, and it's all in a mindset. And Bill Clinton was close to unlocking that and figuring that out, and we've wasted now 7 years not trying to figure out this conflict, and we're set back. But I would say, and I want to go right to questions, I would say that this is a fixable problem, that Hamas's victory should not be seen as the last word in the Middle East story, that the continuing expansion of the Jewish settlement in Hebron should not be seen as the last word, that there is no last word, that, as I said before, and this is the only thing that I truly believe about the Middle East anymore, is that the only thing that you can be sure of is that is in the constancy and the drama of the change that can come before you even know it. And I have this naive hope, because I still retain that essential naivete. I have this naive hope that tomorrow can actually still be better than today, even in the Middle East. And I thank you very much for listening to me for all this time, and I'm happy to take your questions. Should I just call on? If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yes, sir. Why don't you, could you stand up and sort of project, or I could repeat it if you want. I believe you. Yes. What did I say? I can't remember already.
I think you said something about we should take Ahmadinejad seriously.
Yes.
And that you hadn't taken bin Laden
Yeah.
seriously. Did you mean that?
Yeah.
In both cases?
Yeah, I mean, The Bin Laden case is interesting. Did you all hear that in the court? I said in an interview, apparently, it was like, I did that 3 days ago already. You're really holding me. That I think I've learned to take extremism seriously because I did not take Bin Laden seriously. And what I mean by that is a very specific thing. I was in Afghanistan in '98, a week after the first fatwa came out. The international whatever for the destruction of Crusaders and Jews, whatever it was called. I was with the Taliban. I was in Kabul, and we got word of this. Some of the reporters there, one of whom was Danny Pearl. We got word of this, and it sounded outrageous. It sounded lunacy. It sounded like lunacy. Oh, we're going to kill some guy in a cave. Some gangly looking, dipstick in a cave in Afghanistan has just announced that he's going to kill every American and Jew. Okay, fine. Let's go to dinner. I mean, it was lunacy. And when you ask the experts in that period, what does Bin Laden want? Oh, it's just a ploy to gain popularity in Saudi Arabia because he wants to come back and he wants the ulama, the leaders, secular people, and I'm not particularly secular. I'm a religiously observant person, but it's sometimes hard to take this nonsense seriously. There's that great saying about Kabbalah that Gershom Scholem said that nonsense is nonsense, but the history of nonsense is scholarship. This is you read Ahmadinejad's speeches and you're thinking, oh God, you could commit this guy, but he might just mean it, and so. For two reasons, I take Ahmadinejad seriously. There's one reason that I don't take him seriously. The reason I don't take him seriously is that he does not have his finger on the bomb. He does not. He would not have that as the president. He is not the supreme leader of Iran, and that we should be thankful for. There are two reasons that I take him seriously. One is for this Bin Laden reason that you have to take religious extremists sincerely, the second reason is the Jewish experience is if you read history of the 1930s, not the 40s, but read the 30s, it seemed too outrageous to be true, and people said, oh, they're not going to, they're just using the Jewish question in Germany to rally their people, and yeah, it's a little rough, but it's not going to be. Nobody in America certainly believed it. The State Department didn't believe it. And that's why they didn't allow any Jewish refugees in, or very few Jewish refugees in. And the point of Jewish history is that sometimes the worst thing you think can happen does happen. And so for that reason, I take it seriously. It's not implausible in this world that someone will kill 6 million Jews or seek to kill 6 million Jews. Do you want to follow? I think he has a follow-up. You have to buy a book if you have a follow-up. You have to buy 2 books if you have a follow-up. Oh, good. All right. Well, he's earned it. All right. Now I have to buy him a book. Oh, really? I was on the phone today with Peter Boyer.
You were on twice, I was on once.
Peter's a colleague of mine at the New Yorker. No, I'm telling them. They don't know that. He's a bright guy. All right, let's get to the question. What's the question about Peter Boyer? I'm a better reporter, if that's the question.
I asked him why the New Yorker, and if the New Yorker had sent you to the fair state of Vermont. And I wish to state, in posing the question, that I live in New York.
Understood.
When I come to Vermont, and I think of what you hear in almost every gathering in Vermont, is down with the war in Iraq, down with Bush, everything we're doing is wrong, nothing we are doing is right.
Okay.
Now, when I presented this to Peter, my first conversation with Peter, I didn't call him, he called me. I asked him point blank, I said, one of your magazine people is coming to Vermont tonight. Would this be an interesting evening to hear about? Or are we going to, if you'll pardon me for being insulting to the audience, pander to Vermont? In the lead-in this morning, which I picked up on the ferry crossing from Essex to Charlotte, we can't ignore these people. We have to take them seriously.
Right.
By taking them the means to do it.
Well, they don't have the means yet.
Not quite. But a tablespoon of this, or I don't know what of that, and you have mass.
Okay, but let's, is there a question? Yeah.
The question is, how do you take such people seriously, and what do you propose? As a journalist, can you take a position with respect to this, or are we fact-gathering here?
Well, I'm opposed to genocide, yes. I don't understand the question, though. I mean, yes, you know, I have very conflicted feelings about Iran. Let's talk about Iran directly, I mean, if that's what you want. I mean, I take the threat very seriously. Iran is not I mean, you're in a very tight pickle, and you should have sympathy for any American president in this pickle, because you have a country that's run by anti-American theocrats who do all kinds of awful things to their own people. You have a population in the country. I mean, Iran, the population, the young people especially, are more pro-American than virtually any other country in the Middle East. So here's the problem. There are a couple of problems with using a military solution to solve this Iran problem. One is that we don't have much of a military to use right now because we're busy. Two, and let me be careful here, and I'm not pandering to the audience because I say this at right-wing crowds too, and let me phrase this in a certain way. There are those who say that this administration couldn't organize a birthday party. I'm not necessarily one of those, but I think we've learned, and I'm one of these people who believes that the Iraq War didn't have to go the way it did, but that mismanagement led us to this position. If you were asking me just in a vacuum, do you think that this American administration can pull off an attack on the Iranian nuclear program that would succeed militarily? I would say let's wait a little bit and just wait a little bit. Well, let me. There's probably other questions, so let me just finish this one point. But on the other hand, the world is weak. On the other hand, there is a serious problem. I personally believe that the sanctions regime can work, and you should give sanctions time. But you don't want to be in a position, you don't want to wake up one day and find out that Israel was nuked, or for that matter, Kuwait. Because remember, who is more scared of the Iranian nuclear program than the Israelis? Sunni Arabs. You don't want to wake up and find out that Iran has used the bomb. And so you have to ask yourself this question in a serious way. You know, what are you going to do today to stop Iran from getting this? And it's a serious thing. And like I said, I think we're in a tough spot because we have no credibility on these issues. We have no particular skill in this area. And we can do the opposite of what we intend if we go military, in that we can turn a population that is pretty pro-American, and we could really incite them against us by bombing their national territory. You know, as we've learned in Iraq, and as people learn over and over again, people take their nationality seriously. But let me just go to something else. Yes, sir, in the back.
You mentioned in your interview 3 days ago that maybe about 2 years from now, Israel might attack Iran.
Yeah. That would stop that from happening? Well, I think Israel wants to wait to see what the sanctions do. And the sanctions from, you know, you get varying reports. The sanctions seem to be working in that, you know, you have a typical Middle East country in a certain way where you have, you know, gas lines and high grocery prices in a country awash in oil. It might be working. And, you know, there are a lot of Iranians who think that Ahmadinejad has gone too far, rhetorically and otherwise. And so, like I said, I don't want to be Pollyannish, but things can change in Iran, and things can change quickly. Unfortunately, we've been waiting for a long time for things to change. You thought that the revolution was a 2-3 year deal and that people would overthrow it. These guys are pretty well entrenched. There's not a lot that can stop it. I mean, the thing that could stop Israel from doing this is obviously the assessment that it won't work. Assessment that the U.S. won't allow it to happen. Of course, it can't happen without the U.S. because Israeli planes have to fly over Iraq, whose airspace is controlled by the United States of America. So it can't happen without U.S. approval, and it might not get U.S. approval. And it won't happen if Europe stands with the United States and the rest of the world, including Russia now, and says to Iran, no, don't do this. Yes, in the back there.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, you're welcome.
Back to Israel and Palestine for a second. What do you think about Jimmy Carter's book, which said kind of a mirror image of what you were saying about the problems in war with Palestinians?
I think he was wrong. I mean, I don't think it's a very good book. You know, I mean, it's not well written. It's not very interesting. The funny thing is that look, I'm basically I don't know if we're getting too granular or whatever, but I'm basically a Geneva Accord kind of guy. The Geneva Accords are this non-governmental program that devise an equitable solution to the Palestinian-Israeli problem and sort of gives out the demarcations of what the Palestinian state will look like and sort of the whole thing. It's not that far off from what they were even talking about at Camp David. Everybody knows what the future needs to look like. And so I have no problem with that basic understanding. I have a problem with his understanding of Jewish history and where the fault lies. And I have a problem also, I mean, I have a problem with the word apartheid. It's not the right word for the situation. It's actually kind of insulting to people who suffered under apartheid in a way. He's talking about the wall that the Israelis built. I don't like the wall particularly. And the reason I don't like the wall is not because it's a wall. I don't like where it runs. I would rather have it run closer to the Israeli border than where it is now. At a couple of points, it butts into the West Bank a few miles. It's very, very hard to stand against the wall, however, because the wall actually has stopped suicide bombers from crossing. I mean, the wall was built not to make actionable a land grab, not to engage in a land grab. It was built as a dire response. Remember, it was proposed by the left originally, not the right. It was proposed as a response by the left to stop suicide bombers from coming across the border. What happened was it became partially a land grab because certain people in the government, right-leaning people in the government, said, you know what, let's not put this right on the border, let's move this. And that's where it loses political legitimacy. Carter doesn't seem to care in this book that Israeli children and civilians were being blown up by suicide bombers who were coming across this line where the wall now stands. And he also has there's this weird subtext in the book. It's a very strange thing, and you have to read it carefully to get it, but it's a book meant to be read by evangelical Christians who are very, very pro-Israel, and it's trying to convince them not to be pro-Israel. It's a good reminder that before evangelical Christians were like the Jews, they didn't like the Jews very much. Like Carter never got the memo or something. And it's all this. There's this kind of weird subtext of, you know, and then the Jews built their devious wall right through the land where Jesus walked. And it's almost as if, like, I mean, you read this thing and you think that Jesus was blocked at the wall from getting to Bethlehem or something. And the book is really designed to agitate Christians against Israel. And it's a strange product. I would recommend to you a much better book about the situation of Sari Nusseibeh's new book. Sari Nusseibeh is a foreign PLO official in Jerusalem who is now the president of Al-Quds University, who has written a remarkable memoir, which is, and maybe it's easier for me to take hostility toward Israel from an Arab than it is from a Georgia evangelical. But it's not, I mean, Sari Nusseibeh is an ardent pro-Palestinian nationalist, but he really understands this conflict, and he does something that Carter doesn't do, which is he actually puts himself in the shoes of the Jews to try to understand why the situation is the way it is. And that's Carter's, I wrote a piece about this, I don't know, it's sort of all coming back out, and I'll make this one final point, and then I'll go to another question. But Carter is proud, obviously, of his Camp David agreement between Begin and Sadat. It should be. It was a great agreement. But I argued in this article that I wrote that Clinton actually had the greater achievement at Camp David, though his Camp David summit failed and Carter succeeded, because Clinton really broke the code. Clinton really figured out a way to convince the Palestinians that an Israeli state was in their best interests, and he convinced the Israelis that a Palestinian state was in their best interest. And Carter is a zero-sum kind of guy. He says, okay, in order to be pro-Palestinian, I have to be anti-Jewish. I have to be anti-Israeli, and that's not the way. He missed the last 20 years of discussion about how to do this. Yeah, in the corner, and I'll go over there. It's an interesting question. Was North Korea on the syllabus tonight? I don't think. Well, you know, one of the things that didn't work in the Iraq War, and I didn't think of this, and I'm sorry I didn't. One of the things that didn't work, you know, the whole idea here, and it's in statecraft, it's not necessarily a bad idea. The whole idea after 9/11 was we're going to make an object lesson out of a country. We're going to show Iraq that it's going to not. We're going to show Saddam Hussein that there's going to be consequences for even dreaming about having a nuclear weapon, right? And therefore, other countries, other rogue nations that are trying to develop these rogue nuclear programs are going to get the message, and they're going to stop. Well, the message that was received was the exact opposite. The message that was received was, man, we better get a friggin' nuke before America comes after us, because once they come after, you know, once we have the nuke, they ain't coming after us anymore. And that was one of the unintended consequences of this. And you know, it's a very strange, I don't know if I'm answering the question as you intended, but there's a very strange thing in Washington right now, which is if you have to listen to all the candidates for president, and there's these slight shifting going on. It used to be, we cannot have a Middle East with an Iranian nuclear weapon. We cannot stand it. Or now it's like, this would not be beneficial for the Middle East, or you know, you can't even figure out right now where people stand on this issue. But it's probably going to be the first issue that the new president has to deal with. And I think that unfortunately the Iranians took the right lesson from an Iranian perspective on what happened, and they saw in North Korea as well. That, you know what, we're going to get respect, and the way we're going to get respect is to have this nuclear program, and then they can't screw with us. You know, and I have to say that looking at this objectively, or trying to look at it objectively, if Iran goes nuclear in Bush's term, it's really a short term, I mean, at least short term for Bush's reputation, a catastrophe, because he announced his opposition to the axis of evil. In 2002, yes, 2002, January 2002. Iraq, he overthrew a terrible, horrible dictatorship, but instead of replacing it with something better and workable, he replaced it with chaos. He pushed North Korea toward the development of nuclear weapons, and now we're in a position where Iran might be nuclear by the end of his term. I mean, it's not the way it was supposed to go. I don't know if that answered your question, but yes, sir. Could you speak up? I'm sorry, I can't. Right. Right. Yeah. That's a good question. There's two ways of looking at that question. One is, I mean, the thing to remember about Iran and its nuclear program is that the Shah had a nuclear program. And the mullahs who run Iran now don't want to do anything less than what the Shah did. They're not going to shut down their nuclear program because God knows the Shah didn't have to. The Shah didn't get very far, obviously, but he was doing it, and there was acquiescence, sort of, from the U.S. because he was an ally. There's a cynical way of looking at Ahmadinejad, which is that it's this kind of weird kind of Levantine Persian prestidigitation. You know, look over here, look at Ahmadinejad, he's crazy. Whoa, he's crazy, look what he said now. And all the while, you know, Khamenei and all the leaders are still saying, okay, build the bomb, just build the bomb and shut up about it. And meanwhile, everybody's focused on, it's Tuesday, so Ahmadinejad is having a conference of Holocaust deniers. And it's Thursday, so he's playing ping pong with Hugo Chavez. And, you know, I mean, and meanwhile, you know, the sane people in the government are still building the bomb. And so, you know, they'll get rid of Ahmadinejad eventually, and people will say, oh, well, he's gone, so the problem's over. But the problem isn't necessarily over. That said, I mean, you know, the Ahmadinejad, and I'm sure there are people who in this room who know a lot more about this than I am, so I'm hesitant to talk about it. But Ahmadinejad is a Messian, is a Shiite Messianist in a way. He's a Twelver, you know, he's the hidden imam, and he talks about you know, he uses the language of Shiite eschatology every day, and he seems really committed to this. And this goes back to the original point about taking it seriously, and just because it's crazy doesn't mean he doesn't believe it. And I think Khamenei, the supreme leader, is much more of a cynic and probably much more deterred by rationality than Ahmadinejad. So I think that a lot of the heat will come off Iran on the nuclear file when Ahmadinejad goes. And you could see it as a kind of clever strategy, which is, okay, we got rid of Ahmadinejad, no more noise, but they're going to still continue with the program. And the reason they continue the program is simply national pride, if nothing else. I mean, national pride and, of course, the ability to confront America as an equal in the Persian Gulf. Sir, yes, sir. Botany, canned foods, what do you want to talk, anything. I said, you have no opinion on it. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, I'm not writing your paper for you, okay? No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm just kidding. It's a good question. It's a great question. No, he's writing the paper right now. he's like, he'll be done in 10 minutes. One Washington insider said, like I know anything about this. No, I mean, I've been in Iraq and watched these guys, and it's obviously no good. I mean, it's obviously no good because they don't fall under Uniform Code of Military Justice. You don't even know who's supervising these guys. A lot of them are great. I mean, don't get me wrong; they're good at what they do. But a lot of them, if there are killers in their midst, and there are some, we've seen that, they don't fall under the same rules of war, and they don't fall under the same laws that govern the behavior of American soldiers. And it's creepy. I mean, it's creepy to hire mercenaries. I mean, it's one step further than volunteer army, which already separates out the project from the American people in a kind of way, whatever project you happen to be engaged in. But I think the single biggest factor, and this is what you do when you ask these guys, and I've seen this, in Iraq and in other places, because they're not just in Iraq. I mean, they comprise basically, there's so many contractors that can make their own brigade. There's so many private military contractors. One of the things that's incredibly unfair about it, how much they get paid compared to our soldiers. It's just not, it doesn't feel right. But when you ask them, said, who do you work for? Who is supervising this project? Is it the embassy? Is it the CIA? Is it state? Is it the military? And you can never figure it out. And it's just not a healthy thing. You understand why, out of necessity, this is done. Sometimes you want to hire private guards, but it's much better to grow the army and have those people under military justice and under direct military supervision. I think just if you look at the numbers of incidents, these private military contractors are causing a disproportionate number of these shootings. Drive-by shootings and on the roads. And on the Gaza-Palestine and the Gaza-Israel side, there are none, as far as I know. So I don't know how that applies. I don't know who would. I mean, Israel has a universal draft, so it has the manpower, and it wouldn't. I've never seen Israel use those kind of private military contractors for that kind of work. I think you could see a day when there are international troops separating Palestinians from the Israelis, but I just, and maybe it's just it's not an entirely rational response to it, but I find it a little kind of James Bond weird, these guys in shades and tattoos who are walking around, and you have no idea who they're working for, and they're heavily armed, and they can do whatever they want, and it just lends Iraq more of a Wild West atmosphere than it should have. Yes, sir. You, sir, yes.
Thank you very much for speaking, by the way. This has been quite engaging.
Oh, thank you.
You mentioned Iraq, and just to ensure that we cover the entirety of the members.
Yes. The Yemen question, right?
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on Iraq a little more, and basically regarding, to put it quite candidly, what the hell the United States should be doing now? Iraq should be pull out in a year? Should we prolong our occupation? Should we commit more troops? And
We don't have more troops, so that's a hard one. I talked to my friend George Packer from the New Yorker a lot about this, who covers Iraq for us, and we were just talking the other day about this, and you know, we both sort of found ourselves in an anti-pullout position, not because we think that there's the potential for anything terribly good to happen still, but because it would be unethical or immoral to pull out at this point. Because what you have now is a civil war. If you pull out, you might have genocide. And so if all that's standing between a civil war with 50, 100 casualties a day and a genocide with thousands a day is the American army, then you probably need to leave it there as a check. There's an older school of thought that says that leaving it there, of course, exacerbates the situation. He said he just came back and he says that's not true, and I have to believe the guy who's seen it on the ground. I mean, the problem is that you can't turn back the clock. I mean, I was in Iraq during the early phase of this, from the moment it started, in fact, and there are a couple of there's one big misunderstanding of what happened in the first days is that they did greet. Many people did greet the American troops as liberators. That's what's so tragic about the situation. Not just Kurds and not just Shiites, but Sunnis too. Because Saddam was truly horrific. I mean, it really was a terrible, terrible, sui generis kind of regime. And then what we did is we proceeded to lose the war in the first week. Because as soon as the looting was allowed to happen, as soon as the Iraqi people experienced democracy in the form of chaos, it was over, and then years and years of Rumsfeld, and Bremer, and I mean, it's too late to roll this back. I mean, the whole thing about bottles and genies, obviously. But I'm just afraid that if America pulled out now, that would allow a genocide to happen, and one could argue, from looking at it from just war theory, that you do a good thing by removing a terrible dictator, but then your responsibility is to replace that dictator with something better and not chaos. And since we are responsible for taking the lid off, we now own the problem. I think it seems to me cowardly and immoral just to say, okay, well, we tried for 3.5 years, but you people are just idiots, so we're leaving. I mean, it doesn't seem right, and it doesn't seem fair. I mean, you hear politicians of both parties say, it's a great line. Say, well, it's time for the Iraqis to step up to the plate. First of all, the Iraqis have no idea what that means. It's time for Iraqis to step up to the plate. It's like, okay, I want to see you step up to the plate if there's a guy waiting there with a sword to cut your head off. I mean, that's the problem. That's the problem, is that if we leave, George Packer in the New Yorker, I suggest you read this article from a couple weeks ago, wrote about all the people who've worked for America in the last 4 years. All these Iraqis who basically mortgaged their lives to the American occupation, to the coalition, to the CPA, and then to the embassy, to work as translators, to work in various capacities, and now are deathly afraid that this is Vietnam all over again, that it's going to be one of those scenes of Iraqis, desperate Iraqis climbing onto the skids of helicopters to get the hell out, because they know that if the Americans go, they're all dead. And we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of people who really believed us. That's what's so sick about it to me. I mean, it makes me feel sick. That really believed us when we came in and said, well, we're here for good, and we're gonna give you a democracy, and we got rid of the bad guy, and here's some electricity, and here's this, and here's that, and they believed it because we were America, and they joined up with us, and now they're dead if we leave. And so it's just, geez, I just really depressed myself. Yes, sir. Yeah. It's another bad regime. I think all of us are on. I call it. I've written about this. I call it the Scowcroft-Wolfowitz continuum. And 5 years ago, Brent Scowcroft was seen as a cynic who would deal with any government as long as there was money to be made or stability to be bought. And everybody thought, the Wolfowitz ideal, that's nice, democracy for everyone. Now, obviously, many people have moved toward the Scowcroft side of that and away from the Wolfowitz on the realist, neoconservative, idealist spectrum. Answering that question 4 years ago, I would have said, Syria, they torture their own people, they murder their own people, they're terrible, they're this, they're that, they support terrorism. All right, fine. And we can't talk to them. At this point, it just seems that an alternative strategy, given the problem with Iran, would have been for the United States to engage Syria, deal with it as it is, not as you want it to be, and try to induce Assad to break away from Iran and isolate Iran, take away its principal Arab ally. And, I think the Democrats are playing a dangerous game when they endorse Pelosi's mission, because they won't like that sort of mission when they're in the presidency and the Republican speaker is going off and doing a little diplomacy on the side. But she, the idea seems prudent at this point to try to engage Syria. And, here's one of the secrets about this is that Israel wants to engage with Syria. Because unlike the Palestinian Israeli crisis, which is becoming a theological problem, the Syria-Israel problem is purely a real estate problem at its root. It's about the Golan Heights. And Israel would love to be able to engage, but the U.S. administration is telling Israel not to engage with Syria. I mean, which is like one of these things that your head spins. And Israel's doing what America tells it to do. But you can just imagine a scenario in which America and Israel together approach Syria and say, look, if you do X, we'll do Y. And Y includes getting back the Golan Heights after 40 years. Something, by the way, your father, the late president, couldn't achieve, Mr. Big Man. So, I mean, I find myself, to a surprising degree, sympathetic to the sort of the hardcore realist, deal with them as they are. Do you want to do one more? One more? Yeah, there was somebody with their hand right here. Yes, sir. Make it like a happy question, or don't make it a happy question. Right. Well, if Iran gets the bomb, the age of American engagement in the Middle East is over, basically. But the real consequence of Iran getting the bomb, we already see that, is that you have 5 or 6 different Arab states now trying to begin nuclear programs, including Jordan, which doesn't have the money. I mean, none of these places. Saudi Arabia has the money, but Egypt doesn't have the money. They're doing it. You're going to have a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, because people sometimes focus on, and I think this is really true. Sometimes people focus on the Israeli-Arab dispute to such a degree that they neglect to look at the Persian-Arab dispute, which is, of course, an ancient dispute by comparison, and there's real competition between these two civilizations, and so you. Like I said, there are states in the Persian Gulf that are much more frightened by Iran's nuclear potential than Israel even, and you're gonna end up in a situation where you're gonna have 5 or 6 different Arab states developing nukes. Now that just strikes me as not healthy for the planet to have so many inexperienced states developing nuclear weapons at once, and developing them not because it's a matter of pride, but because it's a matter of necessity in their own minds. And I don't know. I mean, it's a wonderful question you've asked, because I don't know what America does the day after. The day after Iran has a nuke. I mean, one of the tragedies of this last 5 years, maybe tragedy is overstating it, is that I always believe this, that on September 12th, the president should have put $1 a gallon gasoline tax on every gallon sold in America and devoted that money to one thing, which is energy independence. And we're going to need that energy independence soon, because if Iran controls the movement of oil through the Persian Gulf and has the nuclear threat behind it, we're not in a good position. We no longer can control how the oil flows to us and to Europe and to Japan. And so it's, I wish you would ask a positive question, because I wanted to ask something positive. But it's a terrifying scenario, and it's terrifying not because, only because of the Israeli-Iran confrontation. It's terrifying because Sunni Arab regimes are going to feel the necessity to develop these weapons. And those regimes are not stable regimes, as you know. Most of them are merely families with armies. And that is incredibly dangerous thing. And I mean, the final point, of course, is that all this might be happening in the context of a wider Shiite-Sunni civil war, not only in Iraq, but one that spreads beyond Iraq. So we could be in a situation in a couple of years in which Iran is gone nuclear, Iraq has imploded, and there's a full-scale Shiite-Sunni warfare that has spread into Lebanon, that has spread into the oil field area of Saudi Arabia, where you have the regimes in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf teetering, and at the same time developing nuclear weapons, and Palestinians and Israelis fighting on the border of Gaza, and Hezbollah firing rockets into Israel. So I suggest staying in Middlebury, where it's safe. Thank you very much for listening to me tonight.